Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about how to use DOM manipulation to make web pages interactive. We're actually going to talk about how to add interactivity to our page so that when we do something, when we interact with it, when we click buttons, etc., we can actually make the content that is on the page change, make it interactive. So the main idea behind us adding interactivity to any client-side system is that we're going to do what's called event handling. So the idea here is that whenever you whenever you do something to a computer, whenever you move the mouse, when you click on a button, when you type anything, right, when you submit a form, like whenever you do things to a computer, client-side systems will often refer or sort of react to these and think about them in terms of events, right? I clicked a button and that was an event happened, a thing occurred, the button was pressed. And these events get sort of propagated and sent out throughout the computer, and so that in order to tell the computer what's going on. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in code that lets us listen for these events and then respond when they happen. Conceptually, it's a bit like following someone on social media, right? So that we're going to like follow somebody on their whatever account, and then whenever they post, we're going to be able to say, oh, when they post, do something, change, automatically like their post, automatically, respond to their post, right? Do something in response to it. We're going to write out what is the code we want to do in response, and then we're going to set up a way of saying, let's listen for that person, let's follow that person. When they do something, we can then respond to them. Okay, so in a client side, in a web system, right, in order to make web page, in order to respond to events, listen for events in the web system, we're going to use a function called add event listener. So this is a method that we call on an element in order for us to follow that element. What we're doing is we're adding a listener. We're listening. We're adding like a following to that element. Like a baby monitor type thing. We're going to listen for events that might occur or get caused by or shouted out by that element. So as an example, we can add an event listener to a button. So on our page, we have this switch button in here. We have a couple buttons, so we're actually going to make sure we select the right one. Now, recall that in order to select an element, we have to use document.querySelector, right? In order to actually get a reference to that particular button. We are interested in the button that's in my puppy section here. So I'm going to go ahead and get the puppy section button, the button's inside of that. And this is going to be my puppy button. That's the element I want to select. Now we selected the element, we can add an event listener to it. So we're going to take our puppy button, right, that element we selected, and we're going to call the add event listener function to it. The add event listener function takes two arguments, right? So there's argument 1, the argument 2. The first argument is a string. It's going to be what kind of event are we listening for? So in this case, we're going to be listening for click events. We're interested in the event that occurs when we click a button. There's lots of different kinds of events in the web. There are clicking events, there are double click events, there are mouse movement events, there's mouse over, mouse under, there's typing events, there's submitting events, there are changing events, you can define your own events actually in lots of different systems. There's basically all kinds of events, and so we're going to use a name to refer to that particular type. The most common event we work with is clicking events, because in web pages, most commonly, we are clicking things. This includes clicking with the mouse, but also like tapping on the thing on a phone. So it's all gets handled as a click event. Okay, that's the first argument. The second argument is then going to be a function. It's a callback function. It's going to be what code do we want to run when that event occurs. So this is going to be a what to do function, right? What do we want to do when that event occurs? Of course, we can write out that function, right? Our function can be what to do function. And in this function, we can say what we want to do. We can, for example, console.log, you clicked me, right? So really basic, something happened. This callback function is always going to take an argument that's going to be called event. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes, but that's kind of this function does expect an argument. And that's the argument we're going to give it. It's always just that one argument. We don't need to deal with it. Cool. So what this then means is that whenever the button gets clicked, it's going to shout out, oh, I got clicked, you guys. Oh my gosh. It's going to basically post about a clicking kind of behavior. And then because that happens, our sort of automated response will be to execute this function. We won't call this function ahead of time. We won't call it before we click on anything. It's going to be happening only when we click, right, on that event. So with that in place, we can refresh our page. I'm going to hit the switch button, and you'll notice it logged out. You clicked me. Ta-da! It's kind of interactive, right? I can click it again, and it just keeps logging that out, right? Every time I click this, it logs out that you clicked me, right? Because we've now made it so that whenever that function, whenever that button posts on social media, we are responding to it. We are saying, yes, you clicked me. Now, you can write it out this way, right? We can define a sort of a separate function and then pass in that function as an argument. It is much, much, much more common to just take that function literal and write the literal directly inside of this callback. Right. Again, this is the same way that we talked about using callback functions in sort of the previous videos. We're going to say I want to create an add event listener. Here's the event I'm going to listen to, and then here is the function. Here's what I want to do when that occurs. And just to be clear, I just refactored that code a little bit, and it all still works as expected. And of course, then once the button is clicked, we can then start manipulating the page. We can start changing its content. So we can say that you clicked me, and I can then say, well, let's make it so that when we switch, let's change the image from the baby puppy to the adult puppy. So we can do that. Remember, we're going to need a reference to our puppy. So once again, I'm going to do, this will be my image element by doing document.query selector image, the puppy section. Oh my gosh. Put the image inside of that, and I can take my image element and set its source to then be image/husky.jpg, and its image elements alt to be image or to be a grown puppy. So when I click the button, we'll change the page. I click the button, and we change the page. My page is now interactive, right? When I hit the switch button, my image switches to something else. Now you notice that when I click it again, right, when my function clicked again, my image stays the same, right? It's set because, again, I just reset my image to have the same source and alt, but that's what it used to have before. So it's not really switching it back and forth, it's just switching it to one thing at a time. If we want to make it switch back and forth, we can do that. We can add in some logic to make that kind of thing happen. So, for example, maybe what we're going to do is we're going to need to have some variable that's going to keep track of if the puppy is grown or not. Showing grown puppy. And initially, we're going to have this be false, right? Because when the page initially first loads, we're not showing a grown puppy, right? We're showing the baby puppy. Sure. Grown dog. So what we can then do is we can make it so that when I click the button, we can say if we are showing the grown dog, or no, what we want to do is that when we click this button, we want to say, okay, now I want to change it, right? If I was showing the baby puppy, I want to make it grown. If I was showing the grown puppy, I want to make it small. So what we can do is we can take my showing grown puppy and we can turn that into its opposite. We can say, if that was false, make it true. And if it was true, make it false. The easiest way to do this is by using a negator. So this is a toggle structure. We're using the Boolean not behavior to say that if this was true, then not true will be false. And if this was false, then not false will be true. This is functionally equivalent to saying if you had a variable x, saying it's like equal to -1 times x, right? Just make it negative. If it's negative, make it positive, vice versa. This is the same kind of thing, but in Boolean logic. So then what we can do is we can say, all right, we're going to change our data, right? We're going to change the data so that now whether we're showing grown puppy is now switching from false to true. Then we can have some logic. So we can say if we're showing the grown puppy, so we're always going to grab the same image element. If we're showing the grown puppy, then I can make it so its content is the grown puppy. Otherwise, showing not grown, then I can make it so that we're showing the puppy a baby puppy. So we load our page. It's showing the baby puppy. If I hit switch, this can't be so good example of an error, right? I can't assign to a constant value because I by default made my showing grown puppy const, but it's not constant because literally we want to be able to change it. So we're going to turn this into a let. So when I hit switch, it switches to be grown. If I hit switch, it switches back to be puppy. And I can now toggle back and forth between them by doing some logic inside of my event handler. And that's the basic idea, right? That's how we can make web pages interactive. And that's pretty much actually all there is to it, right? You say what event, what kind of user input or behavior is going to cause a change to your page. Then when that event occurs, do the change to your page. And that's how we can make things interactive. And then the complexity of how interactive or how cool your app ends up being is really just about how complex sets of interactions users can create, what kinds of changes you're making to the web page, and how those things might integrate and interact with each other. Okay. So things that I want to make sure to note. So I mean, that's sort of showing how it works. The event, as I said, this function takes in an event, right? That's its argument. If we log out this event, you can actually see what it looks like. So when I click on this button, this event that gets passed in is the click event that occurred. It's the actual event. It's the message that got posted to social media that we are then responding to. So in this case, it's a pointer event. If I expand it out, you can see a bunch of different properties up as part of this pointer event. This includes things like the X and Y coordinates on the page, like literally where in the web page did they click. So if you wanted, did they click the top left corner or the bottom right corner, you can get that information. You can determine things like if they had held down the, where is it? If they held down the Alt key, so if they Alt clicked or Control clicked, you can get that from the pointer event. You can even get the target, the thing that they actually clicked on, you can get a reference to that element. So if I actually log out event.target, I can actually log out which button they clicked in case I want to be able to have the same what to do on click function responding to lots of different buttons. I can be able to say which button got clicked and then have my behavior be changing based on which button got pressed in different ways. So again, you notice if I log this out, it says you clicked on the switch button as opposed to one of these other buttons further down the page. Okay, this is a useful thing to be able to say we want to get which element caused a particular input or a particular change. Okay, so I want to sort of go back to this example I just did with this change in this puppy. So when you're developing applications, when you're developing interactive systems, we don't want, notice that what I did is I created this separate variable for showing a grown dog, right? I created this like this this global variable, right? This is what's called state variable. It's keeping track of the state, the status of my application. What I didn't do is I didn't put an if statement where I said, let's look at the current picture and see is the picture grown up or not, and then try to react based on that. I wasn't looking at the HTML to determine what content I wanted to show or what I wanted to change. What I was doing instead was looking at my data and using my data to inform what I want to display. So that's really the way you want to think about it, right? Think about what is the data you want to show on your page at any given moment, right? What, given some particular state, some particular status, what should your web page be looking like? Then you want to think, okay, based on that data, how do I want to display this content, right? I have this function here, sort of, that says, I mean, it's all inside of this if at the moment, but I have a function that says that depending on my data, whether I'm showing a dog grown or not, what does that look like? Similarly, I had functions up here, right? Like my creating song item, my render song list is what we were talking about from the previous video about adding new songs to my list here, that says, given some data, given a song array, what do I look like? What we then do is after you define, here's my data, here's the status that's going to sort of manipulate what my page looks like, and here's what I look like, whatever that status might be, right? So if I hard-coded the status to be different, my page looks different, right? If I hard-coded my let showing dog to be true, in theory, my page's content should be true. And we can actually do that. I can take this, I can make this a quick function. This could be like my show puppy. And I'll just take this work. All right, I'm going to grab this content. I'm going to put it inside my show puppy function here. And then I can just go ahead and call show puppy. Right. So then initially, right, if my grown puppy is true, it shows that it's true. If this variable is false, oops, sorry, it shows it's false, right? So that now this variable is driving what my code, what my page looks like. Then when I click the button, all I need to do is say, let's change my data, and then call the show puppy function again, right? We just want to sort of re-render the page, right? Show that content different, like re-render, change what that looks like, right? So now when I hit switch, we get the same kind of effect. So that's the kind of behavior that we're interested in, right? Is that when somebody clicks on a button, don't think about looking at the HTML and then sort of making a bunch of modifications to that. Think instead of saying, we're going to modify some data, and then we want to update and re-render the page based on that new data. So what that kind of event looks like is you can think about you have your state, right? You have your data, which is probably going to be an array of data of some kind, right? You have some ways of rendering what that looks like, right? Our render functions, versus this is similar to our, again, our create song item and our render song list functions. And that was going to go ahead and then take the data and puts it on the screen correctly. Then all of our user interaction is actually very, very simple. It says that when someone clicks a button, we're going to modify our state in some way. Now the state is different. We're going to re-render the content. I'm basically going to say, take the old set of songs and remove them, delete whatever used to be there, and now show the new song, sort of refresh, hang up a fresh poster about what the page looks like. We're not actually refreshing the page. We're not reloading anything, but if you really think of it in that kind of way, where you are you're basically taking like a new poster and putting like the new poster up in place of the old poster, right? Like we've updated our concert dates. So it's going to put up a brand new poster. We're not going to go to the old posters and like edit the concert date. We're just going to put up a brand new poster because it's a lot easier for us to think about show poster with date. And then when a user interacts on something, when the date changes, I just say, great, go show new poster. So you really want to be thinking about that your interactions are very simple, right? Interactions just change the data, re-render content, and the complexity is in, based on some state, what does that content look like? Okay, with that in mind, we can go through an example of this and try to get our song form doing what we want, right? So I have a form here that lets me add in a new song, artist, title, and link, and add a song. And what I'd like to be able to have happen is I want this form to let me add a new song to my top 5 list. Okay, so we've already got some functionality that lets me show the top 5 list, right? I've got functions that create me a new song item, and I've got a function that shows me a song, that renders that song array. So if my song has different content in it, right? If the song array looks different, calling my render song list will show different content. Great. So what's my interaction look like? Well, we can go ahead and we'll do that. So this is going to be adding a new song. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to make it so that when I click this add button, it will then re-render the data content. So we can do that. We're going to need first thing we're going to do is need a reference to the button. So this is going to be the form button. Mint.query selector. This is my form section. Good. The button inside my form section. Then I want to add an event listener to my form button here, so that when we click on that button, we want to execute a function that's going to do some work, right? For the moment, I'm just going to log out, adding song. Right? So when I click the button, it goes to add the song. But notice it didn't log anything out. In fact, when I click the button, you see how it took me back to the top of the page? Watch the top of the browser here. It's a little bit hard to see being on the window, but like watch the refresh button in the title here. When I hit my button to add a song, do you see how that flickered and this refreshed? When I submit a form, right, when I hit that submit button, it's actually submitting the form. So when you submit a form, that causes a page reload, right? It's like as if we clicked a hyperlink. It's just the hyperlink takes us to the same place the form already is. We've already seen this a little bit in sort of our previous form work. So that when I click submit on that form and I hit that submit button, it's actually taking me to a brand new page. But it's actually will take me back to the same page, but it's causing a page reload. And because the page has reloaded, we're rerunning the JavaScript fresh from the top. We've lost all of our previous JavaScript content. So what we need to make sure we do is that whenever we respond to form submission events, we want to make sure we tell the browser, do not do your normal behavior. Don't actually try to submit this form. I want to do something interactive locally instead. Don't try to send a new HTTP request. Don't try to take me to a different web page. Instead, let me respond to that. Okay, so in my button here, right, my button is a submit button, so it is causing a submit event. We could actually manipulate this a little bit. So instead of talking about the form button, let's talk about the form itself. So we're going to not respond to button clicks. We're actually going to respond to form submission. So when the form gets submitted, we're going to listen to submit events. Then we're going to be able to then respond to something. And the first thing we're going to do, the very first thing in this function, is we're going to take that submit event that occurred, and we're going to call a function on it called prevent default. Prevent default says, hey, browser, don't do your normal behavior. and your normal behavior is submitting a form, which sends an HTTP request, which refreshes the page. We don't want to do that. Just don't do that. I'll handle it. So with that in place, I refresh my page. When I hit add song now, you notice my web page doesn't refresh. I'm not submitting any new content to the page. Instead, it's just going to let me be able to get my console log, be able to see my content out the end. Okay, great. So now I'm able to add, so now I know my event handler works. This is always a really good first step. It's just console logging that like something happened when you click the button. That lets you know that you've hooked up your listener, you're following the right person on social media, you know that things are working the way you want. All right, the next step is I need to figure out what the user typed in, right? If we typed, oh, so you can see what I've looked at this step before, right? If we're looking at the beat, no, let's see, we could do, we'll do analytics. And oh God, what's the analytics song? I don't know. We'll do the Beatles again, and we'll do Yellow Submarine is not in here. Right. I want to get to the fact that the user has typed in these values into these inputs. So the way that we can do that is we can actually reference those inputs from the JavaScript and then look up what value the user has typed in. So this is going to get a little tedious, but we can do that. Right. I'm going to have, for example, my artist input is going to be equal to document.query selector artist, or no, sorry, my artist input. And my artist input here has an ID of, oh, look at that, artist input. It's almost like I knew what I was doing. So I'm going to select it by its ID because that makes it very fast to get. And then the artist the user has typed in is going to be that artist input's value property, right? The value that the user's typed in is what that value property is going to be what the user's typed in. If I log out that value, or no, this is the artist value. But yeah, let's call it, yeah, let's log out the artist. That's fine. Refresh my page, type in the Beatles. When I hit add song, you'll notice that the artist it's saying is the Beatles, right? We can do the exact same thing then for our title. This is going to, again, be a little bit repetitive. That's okay. So title input, going to the title input. This gives me my title. So this is a little redundant. It looks a little bit, which is fine, good examples. And it's also, that's the way that often a lot of forms work, right? There's a lot of inputs, particularly if you're doing this DOM level version of forms. Okay, so that gives me my artist and my title. Now that I have my artist and my title, I can modify my state, right? So that's, again, going back to my structure here. My step one is I want to modify my state. So that's step one, right? So one, we're going to modify the state. We're going to modify the state by creating a brand new object. So it's going to be a new song object, which will have an artist. That's whatever that artist value is. Title, that's whatever that title value is. We'll skip the YouTube link for now. That's fine. And I then want to take that new song object and I want to put it into my song array. All right. So I'm going to take my song array and I'm going to push the new song object into it. Step two is generally going to be want to clear out any old content that was there. Luckily, my render function already does that, right? My render song list already clears out what used to be there, so we don't need to do that. So then we're really going to get to step two, right? The really important step two, which then we're going to be to update the, or no, so we'll be to re-render the content. And we can re-render the content by calling my function render song list and passing in the song array. So I'm just going to scroll down and do this again. So again, so my event submitting form looks a little bit complicated. There's a couple lines of code here, but most of it's really just accessing the data from the form, right? The actual work itself, right, is just modify some state and re-render the content. Really, you can even think of these things as being part of modifying the state, right? We have to figure out like what is our data in order to create the new song object to put together. With that in place, we can refresh our page. We can add in the Beatles. We can add in Yellow Submarine. We hit add a song, and ta-da, there's now a new song, the Beatles' Yellow Submarine. We can add in the Beatles, When I'm 64. I think they spelled out. All right, we can add in more songs along the way. So at this point, we've now got a page that's interactive, right? I'm able to, I have a form, I can write some content, and I can be able to put that content into my web page. Other fun things it lets be able to do is we really think about this way. It also lets us be able to do stuff like after we want to render the content. We could also, for example, as part of re-rendering, change the forms, right? We can take my artist inputs value and set it equal to blank. And we can take my title input value, set it back equal to blank. So now when I refresh the page, and if I want to again add the Beatles, Yellow Submarine, when I hit to add a song, it's there, and notice my form now clears itself out because I've added some content to say some code to say get rid of the old values so you can type in new ones. Okay. Importantly, when I refresh the page, all my songs go away, right? Anything I'm adding into this data sort of locally through this interaction isn't being persisted. It's not being stored in a database anywhere. It's just part of what's in memory in the page. So when you refresh things, it goes back to as if you had never run that before. That's totally fine. That's what we're going to start for now. We'll eventually learn how to add persistence and databases and stuff to make that work. Okay. And that's the basic structure. So that's the general idea to how make things interactive. The important parts here is that we're going to take elements, we're going to add event listeners, we're going to listen for particular events. That takes in a function for what event we want to look for. In that function, then, we're going to do two main things. We're going to modify whatever our existing data state happens to be, the status of our page, and then we're going to re-render our content, show new stuff, using the DOM manipulation that we've talked about previously. And that's, I mean, it sounds simple, and we just do that simple thing over and over and over again in more complex ways in order to create every kind of interactive application you can ever think of. Great. And so that's the basics on how we do interactive DOM manipulation.